Just in time for Father's Day, a new book takes a look at fatherhood through the lens of popular culture. What can film, TV, video games, and other form of media tell us about being a dad? And how close are those myths to reality? Author and recent dad Cian Cruise aims to find out in Dad Bod, Portraits of Pop Culture Papas. Welcome to the bookshelf.
Thank you very much.
First off, I know you're a recent dad. Is that reason enough to have written the book, or were there some particular insights you were looking for as well?
Well, I think what happened was around the time I became a dad, which was right at the tail end of 2018, I also noticed that there was a huge surge in dad-shaped media. Especially, I'm like a big nerd, love video games. There was The Last of Us, there was God of War, similar nerd culture stuff. There's The Mandalorian coming out, all of the, and The Witcher for that matter. All these properties sort of beginning to explore the territory of fatherhood, and especially surrogate fatherhood, from a potentially new lens. So I was curious, did they have something new to say about what it meant to be a dad? Because I think being a dad nowadays is very different from all the figures that I grew up on, largely action movies from the 80s and 90s, where there were very different ideas of masculinity and therefore fatherhood. So the initial conceit or the core seed idea came from, has anything changed in the last 30 years?
And a dad bod, as you define it, it's not just the physique in popular parlance, but it's, I guess I would take it to mean an archetype for fatherhood we acquire from consuming mass media and then internalize as a definition of what being a dad should be. And you write, every single dad I've ever seen in a TV show or movie helped inform my idea of fatherhood. And then you ask, what story has the media been trying to sell me about fatherhood? And what did you come up with?
Well, I think the curious thing about the term dad bod is that we do have like an immediate idea of what that shape is. And what's neat about it, when we compare it to old ideas of masculinity, is it's a little bit softer. It allows softness into what we might call the conceptual vocabulary of masculinity for maybe like the first time in 2000 years. I mean, I'm an amateur historian at best, but a lot of our ideas of masculinity are very hard and they're predicated on muscles and violence. So I thought that there's one interesting new element added into the mix. And the other side of the coin, which I thought was interesting, was that the dad bod is also one of the first times there's a widespread account of masculine identity being predicated on what someone looks like. Women have had to deal with this forever, but now the idea is that if a guy looks a certain way, and there are studies done around the time I began writing the book that indicate this, that people assume certain things about a guy's psychology based on his bod. And the rough rundown on it is, if you're really cut, if you're a gym bunny dude, then you're a little bit narcissistic because you're spending all of your energy internally. And then the dad bod represents a dude who used to be in shape, but now isn't because he's got something else that's taking over his attention. And I feel like that is a very interesting way of looking at both the change in our society on judging men based on their appearance, as well as what does it mean to become a dad? Well, a big part of it is you're not the center of your own world anymore.
Now, as you found, not all portrayals of fatherhood in mass media are positive. One of your takeaways is that men are shown to be incapable of parenting, which itself can be a harmful stereotype in many ways. What do you think this says about how society views men?
I guess in terms of how society views men, I think it feels like we give them a pass. We let them be boys instead of men. We let them be children instead of adults, much, much longer than we allow women. And in terms of the perception, as we see this specifically in sitcoms, there's this weird transition where in the 60s and 70s, the mother was often the butt of the joke. And then as we moved into the 80s and with elements of feminism entering into the mainstream, all of a sudden it was like not as cool to make a woman the butt of every single joke in a sitcom, which has a joke every 2 minutes or something. So then instead, the bumbling father figure emerges in contradistinction to the earlier superhero dads of like Ward Cleaver. So now the dad is incompetent. The dad is more the Al Bundy or Homer Simpson archetype, where they're the butt of every joke and therefore can't parent. They're never shown as being a reasonable authority figure. And instead, we have now these super women, which is an incredibly unfair trope that a lot of interesting books written about motherhood have tackled recently. This idea that so many women feel tremendous anxiety that they're not living up to the ideals of motherhood because they're not able to have 2 jobs and care for the kids and keep the house clean and do all of this while changing the emotional diaper of their father or their husband. And so these dynamics are very, I mean, they're not hopefully telling people how to live their lives, because hopefully most people are able to think for themselves and not just do exactly what TV tells us. But these images are pernicious and they're ubiquitous. And when it's repeated over and over and over again, we accept it in a somewhat unquestioning way. So a lot of Dad Bod is about doing the kind of thing a yokel would do. When a yokel goes to the big city, they say, well, what's with these tall buildings? What's with all this noise? What's like, they take what everyone in that context takes for granted and they try to look at it a little bit carefully or with a little bit of ignorance and to say, where does that take us? And that's I guess that's another like structural thrust of the book, is to take stuff that's right in front of our face and say, wait a second, let's take a look at this. And one of the sad things is that it's actually shown how little the needle is moved in certain regards, especially vis-a-vis like whether or not dudes ought to grow up. In the book, I talk about how there's a very little difference between a very contemporary movie, such as What to Expect When You're Expecting, which is based on it's a weird movie, but based on a very good book. And then I compared it to Three Men and a Baby, and which is, from the early 80s, great rom-com, or I guess, I don't know, buddy com with Ted Danson and Tom Selleck and Steve Guttenberg, where they're kids, like those dudes were like in their 30s and 40s and they were professionals. One was an architect. And yet when given a baby, they didn't know how to deal with it. They had to rely on a woman. So the fact that that needle hasn't shifted at all, or have shifted very slightly and perhaps only in tiny increments over 35 years says something about our culture.
Well, as you say, a culture full of dad bods, but bereft of father figures, which I think is a great way to sum up that particular insight. But the trope of the bumbling dad, no better personified than in Homer Simpson, one in a long line of bumbling dads. And as you mentioned earlier, this is particularly harmful because it allows dud dads the world over to get away with it. Mm-hmm. And perpetuating the stereotype that competent, nurturing, and caring is somehow unnatural for men folk. And I think part of the great thing about this book is that besides being media criticism, it's also memoir. And you talk about how you go against the grain of that and how most modern dads that if not all of them, they do too.
Yeah, and that's one of the huge touchstone for writing the book came from being around other young dads and even older dads, even my own father. Like the idea that men don't have emotions, the idea that men can't nurture, that they can't be affectionate, that they don't want to care or perhaps shouldn't want to care, is dangerous in part because it's repeated so much in our media, and it's also dangerous in part because it's just not true. Every dude I know cares, and especially the dads I know care about their kids. Like, men have emotions and a rich emotional landscape, and the more we do as a culture to give men the vocabulary to talk about it and to acknowledge that that's not somehow unmanly, I think can only benefit us in the long run. But I don't want to get too preachy about it and stuff, or even too theoretical. It's just like I saw one thing in TV shows, and then I saw another thing in real life, and I couldn't reconcile the two. So I had to dive into that.
And there's a great example you bring up in the book too. The exception to all this bumbling in the sitcom dad universe is Johnny Rose from Schitt's Creek, as portrayed by Eugene Levy. How would you say he's different in that he's more realistic? He's more in line of what you know a dad to be.
Um, I Johnny Rose is such a fascinating character. He is a bumbler. He is incompetent, but he also cares and he tries, and through sheer will and I don't know, like the constant stalwart belief in the identity and value of each his children and his wife, who are like nutty characters, right? But he believes in them and believes in himself, and through that is able to help them change and help them grow and help them accept this reality. And it's important to know, like, those are four characters who had a very easy time ignoring reality for the vast majority of their life because they were super rich, and now they can't. They had to actually face it. And I feel like it's a very curious combination because he's just as funny a character, despite having a real emotional core. And furthermore, I mean, one might also point to the mayor of Schitt's Creek, who is sort of a counter to Johnny Rose. He's also a very emotional character, and he, like, despite like being cast as this opposite from a different class structure from a different background, small town as opposed to cosmopolitan, he's still an emotionally driven agent because we're all human beings.
Now you go through a number of different dad bods in the book. I love all the names and the categorizations. There's the distant driven dad, the major dad, the adventuring dad, and then the diehard dad. And that's the one you identify with the most. And why is that?
A big part of that is because Die Hard is my favorite movie of all time. Like, I watched, as I go into gratuitous detail, like I watched Die Hard when I was like 12 years old, and I never looked back. I've seen that movie over 20 times in theaters. I've seen it dozens of times on airplanes, televisions, monitors, cell phones. Like, beat for beat, I could probably walk you through that entire movie. So that's a one big part of it. The other reason is that I really feel like it, despite being orthogonal at best, it really captures what being a new dad is like. I mean, Bruce Willis's character, John McClane, is trapped in a situation he can't get out of. He is completely and woefully unprepared. He is talking to himself because he's slowly going crazy from the pressure of the situation, and he doesn't even have any shoes. That's what being a new dad feels like. I mean, metaphorically speaking. You're thrust into this situation. It's loud, it's crazy, you don't know what you're doing. There's a little person whose life depends upon you. The stakes are very high. You're sleep deprived, and you're forced, much like, for me, the crux of that movie is when Bruce Willis is yanking, sorry, spoiler alert, he's yanking glass shards out of his feet and realizing he never apologized to his wife because he was trapped in this perception of masculinity that he had to always be right. So he had an emotional realization about his family, which helped him carry on. That again is, I mean, fatherhood, for me anyways, and for a lot of people I know, puts you in a situation you've never been in before and forces you to come to reconcile some very deep truths about yourself.
And having taken readers on this journey through all these characters in film, TV, video games, and other media, what do you hope people get out of or take away from the book?
That's an interesting question. I mean, more than anything else, I guess I want to do two things. I want people to look at the stuff in their life, and in this case, let's say the media in pop culture, and try to look at it in a new way. Try to look at it and understand what is this stuff selling us, as you mentioned earlier. What image of the world is being portrayed here? I think that, I mean, I have my background in university was in philosophy. So it's all about trying to look at the world in a new way. I think that's a big part of it. I think another part of it is, and this is a very grandiose ideal, and I know that if I've contributed anything to this, it's a very small piece, but I would love to have contributed a very small piece of redefining and remapping what it means to be a man in our culture, and to help people define masculinity for themselves. And no matter what kind of person you are, no matter what your background is or your orientation, I feel like to be able to take that definition away from a place of negativity and toxicity. And because for a long, long time, it was predicated on not being a woman. It was predicated on putting other people down, on differentiating out groups. So to instead try to define it individually and individualistically, I think would be a valuable step forward. But like I said, that's a grandiose ideal, and I would hope that I've contributed a grain of salt to that pile.
And finally, has writing this book made you a better dad?
Well, I'll answer that in the form of a story. My wife, who I love dearly and is incredibly supportive of my work, has not yet read the book. And when I was working on it, we talked about it a little bit, but I kept a lot of it to myself until one night when I was in what Joseph Campbell calls the darkest hour. I really wasn't sure where I was going, really wasn't sure if I had something, really wasn't sure what I was doing. So I read out loud, and I thank her patience for this so much. I read out loud about half of the book to her. And on the one hand, she helped confirm that, yes, you have, this is a book. This isn't just a jumble of words. But on the other hand, she pointed out a bunch of different things that she's very happy to hear I'm aware that I do. Because only by going through this process was I able to recognize a number of, honestly, sexist tropes in terms of behavior that have embedded themselves in my understanding of myself and how to interact in the world with other people. And it was only by taking a scalpel to these movies and TV shows and video games, put me in a safe space to also take that scalpel to myself. And it was through that bit of obfuscation or working laterally that I was able to be even more honest and slip in those little asides and those little pieces of memoir bits that were really quite painful to write and think about. And especially in terms of the sexist ones, realize that I've been perpetuating the very things that I would otherwise rail against.
And you felt a bit of guilt, or more than a fair bit of guilt, about writing the book and spending time away from being a dad, actually.
Yeah, that is writing. I mean, as a person who talks to a bunch of writers, I'm sure you're more than well aware, like writing is an act of solitude. And my son right now, he's about 3.5. Everyone I talk to says this is the magical age, be it between about 3 and 5. Not to say that kids above that aren't awesome, but there's something wildly incredible about the fact that their reality is being shaped right now, right in front of you every day. And to choose to step away from that felt like a crime, honestly, even though, and like, full disclosure, this is my first book deal. So I really wanted to do it right. And so balancing those tensions was very difficult, but at the same time, I also recognize that that's something everybody's dealing with. Every parent is dealing with that exact same tension every single day, because we all have to put food on the table. So we have to step away from our kids and away from this like magical wonder. And furthermore, I mean, just to go full circle, it's probably good for them to not be with us 24 hours a day. So yeah, it's a bit of a tornado of emotions and concerns and tensions. And the way I wrote that out was I wrote the majority of the book when he was sleeping. So I either worked late into the night, which is a terrible idea, or I would wake up a little bit earlier than everyone else, which is a slightly better idea, or I would pounce on the times when he was having a nap. And that felt really good, actually, to be writing in between times of play or stuff like that. Because you also have to mention, like, bear in mind, I mean, most of this was written during almost all of it was written during the pandemic. So it's like this hot house of my family in our house, not going outside. When are you going to find some solitude there? Darn tricky.
The name of the book is Dad Bod, Portraits of Pop Culture Papas. It's available from Rare Machines and Dundurn Press. My thanks to author Cian Cruise.
Thank you so much for having me.